Social progress is a noble goal to strive toward, but it can be a frustrating thing to live through. Progress doesn't happen all at once. It's often slow, incremental, and it doesn't proceed along a linear path. Hard-fought advances can be followed by demoralizing retreats, and those never seem to take as long to happen, do they? It can be even more frustrating when our side is in power, at least nominally, and we have an expectation of more progress than we're actually seeing. We are currently living in such a moment here in the United States. The Democrats, the more progressive of our two major political parties, control the White House and both chambers of Congress, which means President Biden and his allies in the legislature should be able to enact the very progressive agenda he campaigned on, right? As it turns out, not really. The Biden administration hasn't accomplished much yet when it comes to passing major legislation. Granted, we're only 8 months into Biden's administration, and I want to pause here to emphasize that fact because I think in our present frustration we can lose sight of it. We're less than a year into Biden's term, but even so, that excuse only carries so much weight. There are two major obstacles blocking Biden and the Democrats' agenda at the moment. The first is the Republican Party. They do currently sit in the minority in the House of Representatives and the Senate, but that doesn't mean they have no power. Particularly in the Senate, Republicans have been able to slow down, dilute, or outright block much of what Biden wants to accomplish. Even projects like the infrastructure bill, which one might innocently assume would be relatively nonpartisan. Remember when Republicans pretended to care about infrastructure when Trump was president? Wasn't that long ago. Republicans are able to succeed at being obstructionists in the Senate because of the filibuster, which allows a sufficiently large minority to block bills from getting to a vote. But the filibuster is its own thing and will be the subject of another video in this series soon. Right now, I want to talk about the second obstacle standing between us and progress, the U.S. Supreme Court. Following the appointment of 3 justices by President Donald Trump, the Supreme Court now has a conservative majority. There's no scenario where this would be good news, but it's especially worrying to progressives now, because right-wing politicians have spent the last few decades crafting legislative and judicial strategies to block and ultimately reverse social progress made on issues like gender equality, racial justice, LGBTQ+ rights, environmentalism, access to affordable health care, and others. But the major target of conservatives for almost the last 50 years has been the right to an abortion, which is guaranteed by the Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade decision. Throughout the United States, but mostly in the South, Republican-controlled state governments have passed unconstitutional laws to ban abortions, hoping to provoke a legal challenge that would eventually land before a right-leaning Supreme Court. Now, finally, after decades of fighting, we have very nearly arrived at such a moment, and a lot of people are pretty scared, and justifiably so. As I said a minute ago, abortion rights aren't the only thing at risk. The Republican Party is actively hostile to virtually every social justice and human rights cause that progressives have been fighting to defend and advance. And given how recently the members of the conservative majority have been seated, it looks like a right-leaning Supreme Court is something we're going to be stuck with for years, if not decades to come. Or maybe not, because there is actually something we can do about it. The conservative majority can be canceled out by expanding the court. And this is a controversial proposal, but it's not illegal, and it's not unconstitutional. It would be somewhat extraordinary, but it's not unprecedented. The Supreme Court of the United States is established in Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, but the Constitution imposes no specific requirements as to the composition of the court. That, along with defining the structure of the federal judiciary as a whole, is left to Congress. When the court opened its first session in 1790, it consisted of 6 members, the Chief Justice, and 5 associate justices. It operated with that composition for the next 17 years. Then Congress passed the 7th Circuit Act of 1807, establishing a 7th seat on the court. The 7-justice composition lasted for the next 30 years. Then, in 1837, Congress passed the 8th and 9th Circuits Act, which expanded the court to 9 justices. That composition lasted until 1863, when Congress passed the 10th Circuit Act, which added, stay with me here, a 10th seat to the court. 3 years later came the Judicial Circuits Act of 1866, which mandated that the Supreme Court be reduced from 10 seats to 7. The reduction was supposed to be accomplished by eliminating the seats of retiring justices rather than nominating replacements for them, but there were still 8 justices serving on the court when Congress passed another bill to revise the court, the Judiciary Act of 1869. That bill established the composition of the Supreme Court we know today, 9 justices. I went through all that kind of fast. Hopefully it wasn't too confusing, but the point is, the Supreme Court doesn't have 9 justices on it today because that number was chiseled on a stone tablet handed down from on high. Congress has the power to determine the composition of the court, and it has used that power in the past to expand it and to contract it. Congress hasn't used that power for a long time, not since 1869, but it has used it repeatedly throughout the history of the United States, and it could use it again if enough members of Congress want to. In 1937, President Franklin Roosevelt, fresh off re-election to a second term, proposed expanding the court as part of the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill. According to the terms of that bill, the president would have had the power to appoint additional justices to the court for every sitting justice who had served at least 10 years and was older than 70 years of age, up to a total of 6 justices. The bill was quickly labeled a court-packing scheme, and Roosevelt himself admitted that he was motivated by the court's hostility to his progressive agenda. Ultimately, it didn't matter. The Judicial Procedures Reform Bill of 1937 failed to pass. It never even came up for a vote, at least not in any version that allowed for the expansion of the court. It was brought to the floor of the Senate for a procedural vote, which sent it back to committee, where the provisions related to expanding the court were eliminated, and that revised version was subsequently passed. But Roosevelt's court-packing scheme failed. In the long run, it turned out not to be necessary. Roosevelt served 3 full terms as president and was beginning a 4th when he died in 1945. By the end of his presidency, 8 of the 9 sitting Supreme Court justices were Roosevelt appointees. Even without the Reform Bill of 1937, Roosevelt got the court he wanted eventually. Unfortunately in this particular context, after Roosevelt, the Constitution was amended to impose term limits on the president, which means the just keep getting elected president forever strategy is not available to us today. And even if it were, or if the Democrats are able to elect a few presidents in a row, the justices appointed by Trump and the previous Republican president, George W. Bush, are still young enough that a progressive majority wouldn't be guaranteed even after 2 or 3 consecutive presidential terms. But even though Roosevelt's just stay president until enough of the conservatives die method for creating a liberal majority on the court isn't a viable option, there is still an important lesson to be learned in the defeat of Roosevelt's court-packing scheme, because it wasn't the Republicans in Congress in 1937 who killed it. It was the Democrats. Roosevelt's answer to the Great Depression, which had left the U.S. economy in ruins by the time he took office in March of 1933, was an ambitious collection of projects and reforms known collectively as the New Deal. While some of its more memorable components included public works programs like the Tennessee Valley Authority, the many infrastructure projects built as part of the Works Progress Administration, and dozens of public arts projects, the New Deal also included stricter regulation of the financial system, measures designed to strengthen labor unions, and laws that sought to establish a national minimum wage as well as a maximum number of hours per week employers could force employees to work. Conservatives, who weren't happy about any part of the New Deal, took an especially dim view of reforms which, as they saw it, expanded the power of the federal government at the expense of the freedom of private enterprise. The Supreme Court struck down as unconstitutional several early acts of the New Deal, including the first attempt to establish a minimum wage. The court, which, when Roosevelt began his first term, consisted of only 2 justices appointed by a Democratic president, both by Woodrow Wilson in the mid-1910s, was undoubtedly an enemy of the progressive agenda, which by 1937 had swept Roosevelt into office with 2 resounding popular mandates. And yet, when Roosevelt turned to his own party for support for his proposal to expand the court, he found precious little. The chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Henry Ashurst, a Democrat, delayed hearings on the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill for 5 months. In addition to Ashurst, the 3 most prominent opponents of the bill were also Democrats: Senator Tom Connally, Congressman Hatton Sumner, who was the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, and Roosevelt's own Vice President, John Nance Garner. Many congressional Democrats believed Roosevelt's proposal to be unconstitutional, which strikes me as an odd excuse for opposing the expansion of the court, since regardless of the merits of Roosevelt's specific proposal in the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill, it was obviously not unconstitutional to expand the court, since the Constitution gives Congress the power to determine the composition of the court, and Congress has altered that composition repeatedly in the past. If there was something about Roosevelt's proposal to expand the court that struck his fellow Democrats as potentially unconstitutional, they could have helped to craft an alternative proposal that would have expanded the court within the bounds of constitutionality, as had been done several times before. They didn't do that. They killed the whole idea of expanding the court. So the lesson is that Democrats, while obviously preferable to Republicans, are often their own worst enemies because they let their timidity and preoccupation with bipartisanship stop them from pursuing change as strongly and as boldly as they should. They're usually facing the right direction, they just aren't walking as fast or as far as they ought to be, which is why we need to push them. Unfortunately, Roosevelt's plan to expand the court didn't have enough public support to convince the reluctant Democrats in Congress to get behind it. Today, a good many congressional Democrats are just as apprehensive about the possibility of expanding the Supreme Court, but the present situation regarding the court is a little different than the one in 1937. Back then, it was the president who was the driving force behind the move to expand the court, and powerful Democrats in Congress who opposed it. This time around, it's a group of powerful Democrats in Congress who have proposed expanding the court, and the president, who has been lukewarm at best about the idea. During the presidential campaign, Joe Biden said he didn't support expanding the court, but in April, as president, he signed an executive order to create a committee to study reforming the court, including the possibility of expanding the number of justices. Now, that's not a big move. Forming a committee to study a problem is often a way to delay having to do something about the problem while giving the appearance of doing something, but at least it's better than a hard no to the proposal. And speaking of the proposal, there is a specific one. It's called the Judiciary Act of 2021. It was introduced in both houses of Congress back in April, about a week after Biden signed the executive order forming his committee, but nothing has happened with it since. And its future doesn't look very bright at the moment, even though the bill is sponsored by some of the most powerful Democrats in Congress The Senate version was introduced by Senator Ed Markey, and the House version was introduced by Judiciary Committee member Representative Hank Johnson and has 31 co-sponsors, including Judiciary Committee Chair Gerald Nadler. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi doesn't support the bill and has said she has no plans to bring it to the floor for a vote. The Judiciary Act would expand the Supreme Court from 9 justices to 13, and that's it. For real, it's a 1-page bill. Here, I'll read you the entire thing. A bill to amend Title 28, United States Code, to allow for 12 associate justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the Judiciary Act of 2021. Section 2, number of justices. Quorum. Section 1 of Title 28, United States Code is amended by striking a Chief Justice of the United States and 8 Associate Justices, any 6 of whom shall constitute a quorum, and inserting, quote, a Chief Justice of the United States and 12 Associate Justices, any 8 of whom shall constitute a quorum. That's it. Section 2, the bit that actually contains the substance of the bill, is 52 words long. It's not really relevant, I just thought it was neat. I'm used to these bills going on and on and on for pages of meticulous legalese, and this one's just like, we're adding some justices to the court. All right then, carry on. Obviously, the main reason to expand the court to 13 seats is so President Biden can appoint those 4 new justices and establish a liberal majority, but bringing the total number of justices to 13 would make sense for another reason too. 13 is also the number of circuits in the U.S. Courts of Appeals, the level of the federal judiciary right below the Supreme Court. And who doesn't like symmetry, huh? I'm not entirely unsympathetic to those Democrats who are reluctant to get behind the effort to expand the court. I get it. Expanding the court isn't unprecedented and there's nothing legally standing in the way of it, but the composition of the court hasn't been altered since 1869. It's a big deal. And there is concern that if the Democrats use their control of Congress and the White House to expand the court to their benefit now, it will embolden Republicans to just do the same thing the next time they hold the White House and majorities in both chambers of Congress, which will happen again sooner or later because this is America and we suck. It's a valid concern. Would expanding the court be an act of political escalation that ultimately bites us in the ass? Honestly, it does give me pause. I truly believe that the Democratic Party needs to be willing to rock the boat more, but that doesn't mean rocking the boat is always the right thing. Maybe expanding the court would only encourage the Republicans to try the same thing in the future. Maybe expanding the court will prove so unpopular with the public that it will cost the Democrats their majorities or control of the White House in a future election. It's a risk. But the thing is, it's also a risk to do nothing. If we do nothing, there's every possibility that a conservative majority will sit on the Supreme Court for the next generation or more. Another 20 or 30 years of a court that stands as an obstacle to progress, to social justice, to reform, to human rights. That's what I call a risk. And that's what ultimately brought me around to supporting the proposal to expand the court. It's scary to even imagine the potential damage that a long-term conservative Supreme Court could do to this country. And faced with that future, I'd rather try to prevent it than just stand here and let it happen and pretend there's nothing I could have done about it. There is something we can do. We can expand the goddamn court. But we may have a limited window in which to do it. Midterm elections are next year. And while I hope the Democrats will be able to hold on to their majorities in the House and the Senate, experience has taught me to never underestimate the Democratic Party's ability to choke, stumble, or fuck up. So if we're going to do this, and we should, we need to do it now. So, Contact your senators and representatives and tell them you support the Judiciary Act of 2021 and you think they should too. And write or call the White House. Info on how to do that can be found online at whitehouse.gov. And let the president know that you support expanding the court, that he should be pushing Congress to pass a bill to do just that. And if such a bill lands on his desk, he needs to sign it and start picking out 4 new associate justices. Now, admittedly, I am getting ahead of myself here. Expanding the court is important, and we need to push for it now and keep pushing, but the hard truth is that no bill to expand the court is going to make it out of the Senate as long as the Republican minority can block it through the filibuster. Which is why, before we can expand the court, we need to get rid of the filibuster. But like I said earlier, that's a topic for another video. The next video in this series, in fact, so watch that one too, when I've made it. I haven't yet. Although, by the time you're watching this, maybe I have. Just check.